Good morning. What I want to talk to you about this morning is the fact that you all have a superpower. I'm going to convince you in the next 20, 30 minutes, I'm going to convince you have a superpower. You may not be able to fly. You may not be able to turn people into a frog with a magic spell. But as data makers, you all have a superpower. I want to start with a question. Do you feel lucky? And when Clint Eastwood said this in the movie, I think he was holding a gun in his hand, and it was more of a rhetorical question, but I mean it seriously. Do you feel lucky? If you feel lucky today, put your hand up. Oh, it's quite a number. Yeah, the majority, I would say. And I agree. I think you should feel lucky. And I'll give you several reasons. Of course, the first reason is that you're all at the conference here with a lot of people with a common interest. We get to inspire each other with stories about data and analytics and AI and other technologies. We have fantastic sessions, fascinating stuff. And we get to be in this beautiful city of Porto. We get to test the quality of our rain jackets as well. So, that is one reason to be incredibly lucky, of course. A second reason, this is my scientific version of world history. You can see the line starts out a little bit flat, and then we get to 600 BC, and suddenly there is this flurry of activity. In India, the Buddha got enlightenment and started Buddhism. At around the same time, in China, Confucius wrote all kinds of books about philosophy and about how society should function. Around the same time, in Greece, all kinds of philosophers started discussing and writing texts, things about mathematics as well. Pythagoras invented the triangle. At the same time, there was a vibrant culture in Iraq. You may have heard of the Hanging Gardens of Babylon. They were created around that same time. And there was more happening. In Latin America, the Olmecs were building all kinds of big stone structures. It was crazy. This period of 50 to 100 years, suddenly everything started happening. And then it was quiet. If you were living in the 5th century AD, it wasn't that active. Around the year 0, yes, some things happened again. The start of a new religion, and the Romans created a huge empire. They built all kinds of aqueducts and theaters that we can still see now. That was another period of activity. But then there were periods in between that nothing happened. If you lived in the 10th century, in the 12th century, life was pretty boring. Nothing really happened. And then the 16th and 17th century were very active again. From the 15th to the 17th century, we had the Renaissance. There was painting, sculpture, music, literature, all the stuff that even today we still see in museums. We go to see it. That was all created in a very short period. And European countries started sailing all across the world and discovering other countries and, unfortunately, colonizing them as well. If you were Portuguese in the 16th century, you could be a sea captain, an explorer. It was like the 16th century version of a startup. And it was an exciting time. There were all these opportunities. And then it got quiet again. Now, of course, this graph is super simplified. But I think you get my point. Since the late 90s, we are living through one of these bursts of activities. And it is not normal. For us, maybe it is normal. We don't know anything else than new innovation every week, every month. But it's not normal. And it's very possible that by the year 2200, that things might stabilize and become very boring again. Maybe by that time we'll have AGI, robots will do all the work, and life becomes really boring. It is not a given that life is so exciting and interesting as it is during our time. So that is the second reason that I think we should feel really lucky. And then even within that period of activity, you guys chose the best subject to be in. Data and analytics and AI. You can have so much impact with data and analytics and AI. And I'm going to give you a number of examples from my own work, things that I and my team have worked on over the years, to show you the kind of impact that you can have. And I want everybody to think for themselves as well, what kind of impact are they really having with their work? I have to make one disclaimer before I show you these things, because even though it's all the work of the UN that I'm talking about, I'm speaking here as a private individual, in a personal capacity. So these are my opinions, not the UN's opinions. I just have to say that. So the first project I wanted to talk to you about, it's a little bit older already. It's from 2017, when they had elections in Kenya. And this is an example of how we use data and analytics to support democracy. Now, the elections in Kenya, they get really heated. There's actually a lot of violence. People die. I think in 2004, there were elections as well, and over 1,000 people died in the violence around these elections. So it really affects the democratic process. And what we wanted to try and find out is, can we predict that violence? Because if we can predict it day by day what is going to happen, then people can take measures. Maybe they will stay inside that day, or the police can patrol the streets. So what we did was we took a database with records of violence in previous years. And all of this that I'm talking about is public data. You can recreate this experiment and play with it for yourself. The database is called ACLED, A-C-L-E-D. And the other thing we used was public news media, both traditional media, the digital version of old newspapers, and social media. And we took all that information and we looked at the times when there was violence. What kind of media was being broadcast at that time? The volume of the media, the sentiment, the intensity of the sentiment, whether particular actors spoke up, whether particular topics were being talked about, all of these kind of factors. And we created a model out of that to predict the violence, to find this correlation with violence. And then when the elections happened in 2017 in Kenya, we ran that model live. So whenever news came out, we would feed it into the model and have it predict for the next 2-3 days. And actually, the predictions were quite accurate. Now, whether we were just lucky or whether our model was perfect, that I don't know. But it wasn't really the point. The point was to demonstrate to people that this is a way of using data and analytics to support a democratic process like this. And unfortunately, there isn't that many elections where we have a chance to test out our model, but you can imagine that you can use this in many other cases. So that is one example. I want to talk also about some of the open data that we have. If you go to this website, this is of the UN Development Program. There's another site called data.un.org, which is the UN Secretariats. I like the UNDP one a little bit better because it has all kinds of examples of analytics of different sustainable development topics. And you can choose by topic, you can choose by country, and see some examples of what you can analyze. And then the data is there, and you can do it for yourself. So it isn't really about these graphs that you can find there. Those are just examples. It's really about sharing the data and inspiring people to start doing something with that data. And I think that is, one should not underestimate the impact of that, of inspiring people to use analytics, even whether it is within your own organization or whether it is in the world. We've also analyzed diplomacy, which is one of the core roles of the UN, to facilitate diplomacy between countries. Maybe a little side note, people get sometimes confused about what does the UN do? It's the countries come there to decide stuff, but you also have operations in the field. You bring food to people, and how does that all work? And just to give you the sort of 1-minute version of the history of the UN. After the First World War and the Second World War, people thought this is a really bad idea, right? That some countries disagree, and half of the world joins one side, the other half joins the other side, and before we know it, the whole world is at war. We should avoid that, right? We should have a platform where we can discuss our issues before resorting to violent conflict. And that happened in 1946, 1948. The UN was really started operating, and that worked well for about 10 years, and then the Cold War started. And then when Russia and the Soviet bloc said blue, NATO and the Western bloc said green. And when one side said 7, the other side said 5, and they couldn't agree on anything anymore. And there was a whole bunch of countries that weren't aligned with either side, sort of the third world. And those were countries like India and Brazil and Tanzania. And they all came together and they say, listen guys, nothing is happening anymore. All the political discussions are stuck. And we're here anyways together. Let's do something useful. Let's set up an organization for children. We'll call it UNICEF. Or let's do something for agriculture, for food. We'll call it WFP. And all these other organizations, these specialized programs of the UN, were set up in the 1960s, 70s, mostly in the 60s, as an alternative for these political discussions that weren't happening anymore. And then the third thing that at some point the UN started to do was peacekeeping missions, when people asked us to mediate, to create a buffer zone between two countries that wanted to stop fighting. Anyway, so that was a brief history of the UN. Now, on political alignment, what we did was looking at some of these discussions, some of the resolutions that are being adopted every year in the UN. Every year there is dozens of resolutions that are being adopted. We analyzed the text of that, and we made little semantic graphs of the sort of the topics that are in these resolutions. And then we looked at the voting. And we tried to find clusters in that voting. If you have a particular topic, it's very hard to say with the voting, are you actually in favor of it or not? Because of the phrasing of the resolution, it's not that clear. But what you can see is, are there patterns where certain countries always vote similarly on a particular topic? And we did that, and we found all kinds of patterns in there. And we created a tool out of that diplomats can use to say, if I want to propose a resolution on, I don't know, water management in the Middle East or on the rainforest in South America. Who is going to be my allies and who is going to probably vote against it? And that can help them to sort of prepare that resolution and to start having some discussions over coffee with other ambassadors and garner some support for their resolution. So those are very concrete ways in which we can encourage and support diplomacy. Decision support is another very powerful way in which we can have impact with data and analytics. This example is from the Office for Humanitarian Affairs, and they have a big pot of money that is not for them, that is to give to humanitarian projects all around the world. And it's really a lot of money. I think it's 1.5 billion at the moment. And they get hundreds of project proposals from NGOs, from national organizations, even UN organizations, to do projects to be funded with that money. And this is a small group of people who try to manage it. There's 3 people, basically, who need to read all these hundreds of project proposals of 150 pages each. And the donors who give us that money, they have certain priorities. So one country might give us $100 million, but they say, we really care about the education of women in long-lasting emergencies. Another country might say, here's another $50 million, but make sure you take care of people with disabilities. So these poor people who have to read these hundreds of project proposals, 100 pages each, they have to look in these proposals for these particular topics. And the people who write these proposals, they're not aware of these priority frameworks. In fact, the priority frameworks change over time. So it's not like it's written in the title that this project is about the education of women. But then on page 27, it might say, as part of this project, we're setting up a network of vocational centers and will ensure gender parity in the student population. If you read that as a human, you say, yeah, that's exactly what I'm looking for. But to analyze that automatically for a computer is not easy. So we knew we wanted to use natural language processing to automatically assess these project proposals to see how well they align with the priorities. But we had to create something else, a semantic layer, a knowledge graph that tells us that schools vocational centers is some type of schools, right? And that all has to do with education. There are strong linkages between these topics. And schools may be in a building. Not all buildings are schools, but often a building a school has a building, right? And some of these buildings, they have ramps in front. And guess what? That ramp is for people in wheelchairs. So it relates to disability. And that's how we use knowledge graphs to create maps. And the spider graph that you see on the screen there, that shows sort of the alignment between a particular project proposal and the priority framework. And we can, of course, use the same analytics to provide all kinds of other statistics, for example, trends over time. How have the allocations of money to projects, how have they improved over time to be more aligned with a priority framework? Or looking backwards in the past 3 years, how many of our projects have supported education of women? So a lot of statistics, and I think the topic that I wanted to talk here about is decision support to make it easier to evaluate all these proposals. But there's many other topics here. For example, building trust with the donors to give us that money. You know, the better we can show how we are aligning the allocations of money to their priority frameworks, the more transparency we can provide, the more trust they will have in our projects. So there's many aspects that can be supported this way. Advocacy is another way to have enormous impact with data and analytics. This is a project that we did for the Peace Building Office in the UN. We try, of course, to tell countries don't go to war, avoid conflict. There's other ways, right? But it's not always easy to convince people. What we did was we took data from the World Bank, socioeconomic data of, the GDP and trade and these kind of things, but also things like enrollment in schools. How many kids go to school? And what is the gender parity in school? And then we used the same conflict data, the ACLED database that I mentioned before. It's open source data. We used that again to look at the number of countries that have had long-lasting conflicts over the years. Countries like Sierra Leone or Angola or many countries in the world. And we created a model. We tried to find this correlation. And in principle, what we're doing here is just logistic regression. We used some more sophisticated techniques. We used some, Python and some tools, data analytics tools. But basically, it's regression analysis to see what is the relationship between conflict and these economic indicators. Because of course, if a country is at war, probably it's likely that trade will pretty much come to a halt. The economy will go down by 50% probably. And it's also possible that the schools will close, which means that a whole generation of children don't get a good education. And that's an effect you will feel in the economy 10 years later, 15 years later. So we tried to analyze all these things, and we made a sort of, not totally scientific, but I think for the purposes of advocacy, it was very powerful. We created a calculator where we could put in a country and we could say, yes, I don't know, maybe Cambodia, we know you're annoyed with your neighbor and, it's totally justified if you want to go for war with them. But do you know it's going to cost you $14 million a day to go to war? And that kind of advocacy, it can be very powerful. And we achieved that with data analytics. The last example I have with you is also a little bit older. This is when there were a number of groups in the Middle East that were roaming around and causing havoc. ISIS, I don't know if you remember that, and there were groups like that. And they had promotional videos that they would release every week on YouTube. Basically, it was a commander with a few hundred followers, and they would post something on YouTube to get more followers. We took these texts, we analyzed them, and then we held them against the security incidents, things like roadblocks or killings or bombings or kidnappings. And we created, again, a model to predict what would happen after certain speeches, the kind of words they would use and the kind of vocabulary, the timing of when they released the speeches, whether it was on Wednesday evening or whether it was on Friday morning. And if you look at the colorful flow that you see there, this is when you put in, suppose a new speech comes out today, you can put it in, and the colorful flow will tell you that on day 2 and 3, or actually starting from day 3, the risk of kidnapping increases. But then by the time you get to day 5, it's not that risky anymore. Now, this was never actually put into production. We did this as a proof of concept and to show people and to create awareness that these kind of things are possible. Because in fact, the data that we had from previous security incidents, it was collected with very different purposes in mind. And if we wanted to use it really to get accurate predictions, we would need to start collecting that data in different ways. And maybe we'll do that. But I think creating that awareness that these things are possible is very powerful as well. Hopefully with all of these examples, I've started to awake a sort of realization in you that you, as data scientists, you have a disproportionately large impact on the world. Everybody on Earth has a little bit of impact on the world, right? Every human being has a little bit of impact. But maybe if you're lucky and you're born as a king or a queen, then you have a bit more impact. Or if you are elected as prime minister, maybe you have a little bit more impact. You, all of you in this room, have a disproportionately large impact because of your skills in data and analytics. And I think sometimes we don't stop and realize that, how powerful we are, that we have this superpower. It's like, yeah, it's fun to do some experience, to build some Python code and to create some machine learning models, and we just do it because it's an interesting intellectual challenge and maybe it's our job. But I think we should really be aware of the power that we're holding. Because as everybody knows, with great power comes great responsibility, right? And nobody knows exactly who is inside that suit of Spider-Man, but to me, it's all of you. So please, this afternoon, go out and buy a Spider-Man suit and use your power for good causes, because you have superpowers. Thank you.
All right, thank you. Thank you very much for this very nice talk, and also with a lot of examples, which is always nice to see. I think especially for the technical people in the audience. So maybe just very easy question, just that we kick off the discussion. So Chief Data Analytics and Emerging Technology. That's a long title as a job title. I bet sometimes it doesn't even fit on the badge. Maybe just a little bit tell us about what's your day-to-day like at the United Nations then.
Yeah, sure. It's the title is just, it reflects a number of different groups that I oversee. The data part is very much about digital transformation, making the UN a data-driven organization, or actually I prefer the term data-informed. The analytics part is both a lot of internal dashboards for our management to measure our performance, like many of people in the audience will do the same things for their companies. And also a lot of the examples like I just showed, those are the kind of things we do with analytics. And then the emerging tech part, which is a lot of AI these days, of course, is about bringing new technologies and new ideas into the organization, and also making sure that we adopt it sensibly.
Mm-hmm. Nice. Okay, that sounds like a very interesting job and like a lot of responsibility, I guess. With great power does come great responsibility. So we already have a lot of questions coming in. I'll just start with the most voted one. So a common comment when using data in non-scientific setting is that we can twist the data a bit around in any way we want to tell the story that we want. And we see that a lot, especially in the news and so on. How can we prevent that and the damaging impact on public and political perception of data analytics and the issues you also talked about?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, there was a book many years ago, How to Lie with Statistics, I think. And you can always lie with data. I think what we try to do often is to provide the source data so that people can recreate it. And many of the data that we use is open source. It's public data. Mm-hmm. We have a policy within the UN that we increasingly want to open up our own data, so that's not only to create transparency of the kind of analysis that we do, but also to encourage others to use that data. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Okay, and then regarding supporting diplomacy, so that's also something you mentioned in your presentation. How does this differ, for example, from how Cambridge Analytica took advantage of the public data to swing voters? So in 2016, I think that's still on everyone's mind.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think with all of these tools, there are good uses of it, and there are risks to it, and ways in which it can be abused. I think that's unavoidable, and as a society, we just have to constantly adapt to the new possible negative side effects of technology. And Cambridge Analytica was one example where we didn't realize how much we're being influenced by social media and how easy that is to manipulate. I think it's a sign that technology is developing so rapidly that we don't always have time as a society to wrap our heads around it.
Mm-hmm.
And I sometimes give people this example that my grandparents had about 4 major innovations in their lifetime, right? First, electricity came to the village, and then at some point there were cars, and then there was telephone, and I think television was towards the end of their lifetime. Now, with each of these innovations, they had about 10 years
Mm-hmm.
to wrap their head around it
And to adapt.
and to adapt and to think, what is the protocol? When do you walk to someone's house and knock on their back door to ask something, and when do you call them by telephone? And they had 10 years to figure that out. These days, we have 10 minutes before the next new technological thing comes. And the result is that we don't always get the balance right.
Yeah.
And that's a huge challenge.
Yeah, and even with ChatGPT, I mean, it went from 0 users to billions just on the first day of use when everyone saw the potential.
Yep.
Okay, another question. So this is correlation versus causation. So socioeconomic conditions have well-known correlation with crime and conflicts. Although there is always a spark that triggers the problem, how can we exploit data to anticipate these triggers? And is there something there? Are we doing something in that area as well?
We are, there's several projects that are going on to predict conflicts. We call that early warning models. Also to predict violent extremism in countries. And one of the things that we do is looking at sort of the counterparts. If you look at, for example, social cohesion in a society, that is the opposite, or let me put it this way. If you have very strong social cohesion, if everybody feels that they're participating, that they're being heard, that they're being fairly treated, the risk of getting violent extremism is very, very, very low, right?
Mm-hmm.
So if you monitor the social cohesion in a society and you see it going down at certain points, that is one of these triggers where you can say, okay, we want to do something about it. We want to create a counter narrative, or, that's.
Okay. And then another question. So, in your experience, how uniform and universal is the adoption and acceptance of technology and data-driven solution within the United Nations?
I think there is a lot of openness, I would even say enthusiasm, to embrace data analytics and AI and all these solutions. Where it becomes a little bit harder is that when we go to these departments and we say, great, we can build AI solutions for you or analytic solutions, but maybe you first need to get your data in order.
Mm-hmm.
And that is not always an easy job or a fun job, right? To organize your data.
I think most of the people in the room know about cleaning data and how cumbersome it is.
Yeah. So that is the hard work you have to do first, and it takes a bit of convincing.
Yeah, and it's a lot of resources that need to be put there as well.
Mm-hmm.
So I know that this is a longer question, but why do you think many political decisions look like they are made ignoring serious technical analysis of the topic? How can we, with a mostly uneducated population on data topics, so we're talking about data literacy here, help the public understand the unbiased analysis and the pros and cons of each decision?
I think, politics always has a large part that plays on people's emotions. and isn't necessarily grounded in facts. And I think that's where there's a real opportunity for data and analytics to counter that. And I think we're much further right now, where even newspapers and journalists will fact check something that politicians say. We didn't have that 20 years ago. They could say whatever they wanted, and nobody would really go and check it.
And probably it was harder as well, right, to fact check
Mhm.
back in the days.
Yeah.
Okay. Another question. So in developed countries, sometimes we still have a problem with acceptance of results computed from AI, and sometimes we're even a bit skeptical about it. Even simple data analytics is sometimes even seen a bit with skepticism. Is this even more challenging with less developed countries, or what's your experience in this?
I haven't personally encountered sort of skepticism against data and analytics, but there are challenges, of course. Number one is the availability of data, and number two would be the capabilities in country, the talent to do something with the data.
Mhm.
And we need to slowly build that up. But what I find very encouraging is that in this field, so much is open source and free.
Mhm.
So you don't need a lot of investment to start building some analytical dashboards, some Python code, etc. It's all free.
Mhm.
And I think that is very important in order to level the playing field, so that every country and every human being, no matter where you come from and what your economic situation is, have access to that.
Mhm. Indeed, but also sometimes it's a bit more difficult in terms of implementation. How do you see this? So because I think there was a discussion yesterday as well within the social AI, social impact session, that there's a lot of different projects that are being done in the sphere, but then getting it from the lab or from your Python notebook towards actually being used, it's still a long way to go. How do you see this? Maybe as of just a follow-up question.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think there is an easy shortcut to that. There's an easy answer to that. But I think as people become more accepting of data analytics, or even demanding it to see the proof, the data, and the analytics behind something, I think there will be more investment in making it possible to scale up these solutions. And what we've seen in the UN with some of our counterparts, for our donors and our partners, is that 20 years ago it was sort of a curiosity to work with data and analytics, and 10 years ago there was enthusiasm about it. Right now it is mandatory. Donors won't give you money if you can't provide analytics to show it. And I think the same in developing countries. We're also seeing that dynamic, that there is more and more, it becomes mandatory to provide some kind of data and analytics.
All right. But that's also good to know that there is some accountability as well there.
Yeah.
So I'm just looking at the timer now. I have maybe time for one or two more questions. So first one is, we'll go with this one. Do you see us professionals responsible for preventing the use of AI as a manipulation tool instead of empowering in such cases as election and diplomacy? If so, how could we help to do it?
Yes, I gave these examples to show you how impactful data and analytics can be. I think everybody in their own situation should see how they can make a difference within their organization, within their company where they work, or within their community where they live or where they operate. And if that is supporting a democratic process, if that means making sure that people have more information to base their decisions on, or to base their votes on, that you have to figure out for yourself. But,
Okay.
yeah.
And maybe just since we're almost out of time, just as a last question, what can the audience do after they leave if they want to help or if they want to do something to contribute?
Well, working with the UN and contributing to the UN is always possible. We have public engagement programs where we often post a challenge online. It's called Unite Ideas. We can share the link later. And those are projects that you can, a bit like hackathons or longer lasting projects that you can contribute to. We work with universities as well, and we work with companies sometimes on particular projects. So if you have ideas in that regard, write to me or connect with me on LinkedIn, and we can talk about it. But I think mostly with my talk today, I wanted to give you this idea that you are really powerful by being a data maker, and don't underestimate your own power, and find ways to use that to have a huge impact, because you can.